So let me start with a provocative question. If Adam Smith were alive today, what would he like and what he would not like about today's capitalism?
What an excellent question to open with. Of course, guessing what Adam Smith would have thought now is something of a parlor game, so we shouldn't get too distracted by it. But the fact that in so many countries around the world, we have functioning product markets in the way that we do and highly effectively distributing goods and services and generating prosperity and well-being and welfare for people, I think is something that he would regard as a magnificent discharge of some of the ideas of the wealth of nations. He would be mortified, I suspect, by some of the trade shenanigans we've seen over the last few years and by the collusion in markets and outright oligopolistic and crony capitalistic tendencies you see in different kinds around the world. And I think he'd be fascinated. He doesn't really have a theory of technology, particularly in any of his writings, but I think he'd be fascinated to see how technology has changed the terms of trade for economics over the last 50 and 100 years in particular.
In the theory of moral sentiment, Smith talks about our tendency to admire the rich and powerful, even when they don't deserve it. Is this a moral distortion? We confuse wealth with virtue. Is it what we're doing now?
Yes. Well, there are many aspects of his thought in that book which are astonishingly prescient. And that is the forerunner of what we think of now as celebrity culture and all these kind of influences. And of course, it's not really surprising because he sees that happening in his own time. In the 18th century was a time where Britain was becoming a globally dominant country. And of course, goods and services, in particular luxury goods and services, are flooding into Britain. And so he could see these processes of people starting to get very excited about celebrities, even and rich and powerful figures, even in his own time. But there are also other ideas that go alongside that I think are very prescient. One of them is the idea of virtue signaling, or kind of showing off, displaying your virtue ostentatiously in front of others when that may not actually be your true moral feelings. And another one would be materialism. I mean, he has a marvelous line where he talks about the obsession that people have with what he calls trinkets of frivolous utility. And so, virtue signaling, materialism, celebrity culture, there's a heck of a lot in those early writings of Smith's which carry directly into our own time.
This is interesting because many people identify Adam Smith with the idea that greed is good, with Gordon Gekko. And one of the many great things about your book is that you make it very clear that this is the farthest away from the truth. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, Smith is in no sense a market fundamentalist in the way that we think of, let alone an apologist for greed or for exploitation in the way that people associate with Gordon Gekko or in many cases with Wall Street or the City of London. He is a believer in the value of markets as means by which people can not only trade their way to greater prosperity, but also as something that themselves reflect and reinforce a culture of mutual equalities. And so when people start to get super rents, monopoly returns, the returns that come from insider knowledge or from collusion, he's extremely rude about that. And he does so in order to protect what we would consider the benefits of free markets, because those are themselves often distortions of effectively functioning markets. And so the modern caricature of him is grossly mistaken.
We know that Smith was very critical of elite getting together and conspiring against the public. How would he take the Epstein scandal and all the fallout from it?
Well, I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that Epstein, for all his horrors, is that relevant because, we think of Epstein as an abusive single player in a collusive in a collusive, networked world. But the kind of collusion that Smith is thinking about is the one where all of the producers get together to fix the markets and rig the prices. And you can argue that's going on in financial markets, but it will be a slightly separate further point to the way in which Epstein has been behaving. Of course, Smith is very, very strong on the evils of slavery, both the economic evils and the moral evils. And so trafficking of human beings would be something that he would have despised, and he certainly criticized it severely and very much in advance of his time during his own lifetime. But I think the wider point is the few ganging up against the many. He doesn't cast this really in terms of elites versus masses. He doesn't have a kind of Rousseauian view that, as it were, the ordinary human being is necessarily morally preferable or not to others. And the idea of elites is a kind of 19th and 20th century idea in the way that we think about it now. But the idea that the few could get together to rig the system against the many in different forms is absolutely part and parcel of his thinking. And of course, there are famous quotes, but the institution that most embodied that for him in his own lifetime, of course, was the East India Company, which he saw as both a thoroughly pernicious organization in its own right and also a token for a certain kind of morally bankrupt and economically bankrupt style of economics, which he called which we think of as mercantilism, or the mercantile interest in his own time.
Now, Smith is very sort of sanguine about the role of markets in allocating resources and allocating resources by price and competition. But we see in the real world today that networks, and particularly elite networks, allocate a lot of resources through access. Now, if capitalism start to operate more through networks than through competition, is it still capitalism in the Smith sense?
I think that's a really profound and important question. And of course, if the effect of networks is to suborn competition or divert it, or, as you say, compete for it ex ante, then it's hard to see that you would get the benefits that come from the leaning effects and the attempt to defeat people in the marketplace from that.